having occupied the chair since 2002. David's historical interests are very broad, but we know him best, I would guess, as an historian of the Second World War and its aftermath, perhaps especially for In Command of History, Churchill fighting and writing the Second World War, which won the Wolfson Prize in 2005. But David's first book was on Anglo-American relations. And in 2009, he published America, Empire of Liberty, A New History. And I think few Brits have such a sharp eye for things American as David, not least because half his family is American. And in the church, we're very grateful to David for guiding our recent work on slavery and its legacy. And it is, of course, a genuine pleasure to welcome to the Society's seminar a fellow church member at Downing Place. So, David, you are truly amongst friends, and we are absolutely delighted that you have agreed to lead this seminar on religion and American independence then and now. And for guidance, we will be finishing, I hope, sort of 11-ish. If the discussion gets animated and excited, I think we might then go on to 11:15, but certainly no later than that. So we're aiming to finish between 11 and 11:15. So David, over to you, and I'm going to mute myself, I hope.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you, David. Thank you, Michael, for organizing this, and thanks to you all for tuning in. I'm not, David Cornick mentioned America, Empire of Liberty, which was a radio series. It started as a radio series on BBC4, Radio 4, and then became the book. So I've got a sort of feel for the contours of American history, but I'm not a specialist on church history. And so that's, as it were, the health warning before I start. Nevertheless, I have taken quite a lot of interest in how the 250th birthday has been and is being celebrated, commemorated at the moment. And it's been, so if you go down to the, or look first of all at the facsimile, 1823 facsimile of the Declaration, which is the document you'll see actually in the National Archives, the old National Archives in the center of Washington, D.C. There's the actual document. If you go down that page on Wikipedia page on the Declaration, you'll have to go some way down, but it does a breakdown of the Declaration, talking about its component parts. And if you find that, I'll talk a little bit about what it's saying.
That's not in this is a separate thing from the Declaration of Independence. Is it?
It's on the document called the Declaration. It's scrolling down that Wikipedia entry for the Declaration of Independence.
Yes.
Right.
Well, I'm looking at the Wikipedia entry rather than the Declaration itself.
Yes, going down the Wikipedia entry.
I think David's referring to the point partway down that's headed annotated text of the engrossed declaration.
Oh. Not the transcription of the stone engraving of the Parchment Declaration of Independence.
No, you go quite a lot further down.
Yeah.
Yep. Annotated text.
Annotext, yeah, got it.
So one of the essential points that it's making there is that the Declaration is rooted in natural theology, not in divine revelation. So there is a religious background, but it is not one that we would recognize as conventionally Christian. And the preamble, the unanimous declaration of the 13 colonies, says when in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal status to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation. So the laws of nature and nature's God, that's the basis on which they are laying their claim to independence. And you will also see, going further down that breakdown of the document, that it is couched in the language of contractarian political thought. In other words, the notion that there is either explicitly or implicitly a social contract between governors and the governed. And if that contract is repeatedly broken by the governed, by the governors, then the governed have a right to end the contract and take action to create a more satisfactory political arrangement. So that's what I mean by contractarian political thought. It assumes that relationship between governed and the governors that they have. And then what they go on to do is to set out a lengthy bill of grievances, 27, I think, in all, listing the king's repeated injuries and usurpations, all having in direct object the establishment of an absolute tyranny over these states. The direct object of establishing an absolute tyranny over these states. And this is language, particularly the language of tyranny, that is rooted not just in contractarian political thought, but in the political thought going back to classical republicanism, the notion of tyranny, the abhorrence of tyranny, and the right to act against it. So what we have here, I think, is echoes of what the arguments of the English or the British civil wars, because of course it's the War of the Three Kingdoms back in the 1640s, 1650s, in terms of the relationship between Parliament and Crown, the rights of religious freedom. These were central to the Civil Wars, and they are echoed in some of the writings that lay behind the Declaration of Independence. But as I said, this is essentially an argument rooted in natural law and the natural theology, not divine revelation. Now, the main drafter of the Declaration was Thomas Jefferson, drawing on his draft preamble to the Constitution of Virginia, and also work done by another Virginian, George Mason, who drafted the Virginia Declaration of Rights, which was rooted in the English Declaration of Rights in 1689. So again, those are echoes that back to a past from the other side of the Atlantic. But the point of the list of grievances is to indicate that what was once a proper government has degenerated into a tyranny, and therefore, almost QED, these united colonies are, and of right, ought to be free and independent states. So that's the, if you like, the overview of the Declaration and what it's arguing. As far as the religious background is concerned, as I said, natural theology, not divine revelation. And there's been, I think, quite a lot of debate about what what were the religious backgrounds of the founders. It's generally, it's quite often said that most of them are deists in a loose way, and Washington, Franklin, and Jefferson would be put under that label. But that's a fairly loose term. Others are definitely more recognizably orthodox Christians. Samuel Adams of Massachusetts is a Congregationalist. John Jay's Church of England, and then became an Episcopalian after independence. But putting labels on these people is quite difficult, and it's generally suggested that if you wish to try and work it out, you would need to do a number of things. You'd need to check how regularly they were at attendance in a church congregation, how often they took the sacraments, and what language they use, particularly whether they avoided, if you like, God talk, and preferred to refer to words like providence, the creator, the ruler of great events, nature's God, and so on. So this is a reminder of the fluidity of the American church structure before independence as well as after, and that there is in the new country no established church in the way we as dissenters would talk about it, no religious tests for office holders. So much of what is the stuff of politics in Britain in the 17th, 18th centuries into the 19th century doesn't apply in the same way in the United States. So what's interesting, I think, is the way in which there has been a fairly energetic debate amongst Christian supporters of Donald Trump and the MAGA movement to find and ascertain and affirm that these people, whose religious background, as I say, is pretty diverse, that these people were born-again Christians. And that has been something that has been of a lively discussion and continues to go on behind the scenes. And some of these people are, some of the Christians particularly associated with the administration are identified with the Seven Mountains movement, The Seven Mountains movement is apparently drawn from a passage in Revelation and is a statement that whatever the Constitution says about the separation of church and state, Christians of that persuasion associated with Trump and his followers should aim to dominate, a word they use, dominate 7 mountains of contemporary life: the family, religion, education, media, arts and entertainment, business, and government. So, as you can see, that covers a pretty large amount of American life. They don't mention sport, but I think that's part of entertainment, perhaps. Family, religion, education, media, arts and entertainment, business, and government. And a good book that is still, I think, in print, though it's, I think, goes back to the end of the last century, 20th century, is Mark Noll and his colleagues, their edited collection on the search for Christian America, the search for Christian America, because many people associated with the administration believe that America should be, and arguably is, a Christian country in the way they understand that term. Christian America is something that is a very live issue for the administration, and it's part of the undercurrent of what's going on in the commemoration of the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. Someone who was particularly associated with the notion of Christian America was Charlie Kirk, the man who was particularly behind the youth movement for Trump until he was assassinated last year. But within the current administration, Pete Hegseth, who's the Secretary of War or of Defense, depending on what title you choose to use, he openly identifies with the Communion of Reformed Evangelical Churches, the Communion of Reformed Evangelical Churches, CREC, and does, and you can get it from his speeches and his talks on the press conferences, sees Iran, the war against Iran, as a holy war to preserve Western civilization. And Hegseth has been in the habit of praying for soldiers going into conflict and battle, telling them that it is right to inflict overwhelming violence, that's his words, overwhelming violence, in the name of Christ. So this is a quite striking aspect of what Christian America and what the important people within the administration feel. It's also something that Vance, the vice president, a convert to Catholicism, has also talked about, but less intensely than Hegseth, less belligerently. And of course, he has also been, on about recently about the failure of European countries, including Britain, to stand up for civilization based on Christian values. So this is part of what's going on behind the scenes of the commemoration for the 250th birthday. You will, I think, on the 14th of this month, so the end of the week, over the weekend, there will be a big event at the White House to celebrate Trump's 80th birthday, which is a prize fight on the South Lawn, which reflects his particular passions for wrestling and so on. So all this seems rather bizarre, but what I'm trying to suggest is that behind the scenes, not hitting the headlines in quite the same way, is a very clear sense of the direction that the administration wants to go and wants to push the country in terms of its religious formation and religious principles. The other thing that I want to just mention finally is the, see if I can, no, I can't bring that on. All right. Let me just say that to me as a historian, the conception of the Declaration of Independence and 1776 as the really important event in America's maturation as a country and as a power, I have some problems with that, because if you think about it, although America declared its independence in 1776, it remained in many ways a colony of Britain for another 70, 80 years or more, in the sense that the US was not economically it was literally a colonial power. It produced mostly primary products, foodstuffs, timber, things like that for European markets. It got most of its manufactured goods from Britain, particularly in the colonial, post-colonial period, well into the 19th century. In many ways, the crucial event in American independence is not 4th of July, 1776, but I would say 4th of July, 3rd, 4th of July in 1863. 1863. Why do I say that? Because that was the climax of the Battle of Gettysburg in the American Civil War. It was the nearest that the Confederates got to Washington. After 3 days of brutal fighting, they retreated. Lee took his army back to Virginia on the 4th of July in pouring rain, and the wagon train wounded, it said, was going for 17 miles of wagons stretched back. That was the nearest they got to their independence, Southern independence, the Confederate States of America breaking away from the United States of America. That was, as it says on the battlefield, the markers commemorate the high water mark of the Confederacy. And that matters because many people in Britain in the early 1860s thought that it was quite natural that the southern states would break away. They knew that the Union was not fighting to free the slaves. Slavery had been carefully preserved within the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. This was a war for many people in Britain that seemed to be essentially rather like, say, what was happening across Europe, for example, the breakaway of the Italian states from the Habsburg Empire. in the 1860s. So it wasn't a war of principle until Lincoln emancipated the slaves. And then in 1863, it began to be a war of principle, particularly for dissenters in this country. So the reason for mentioning it is that if those two states had gone in separate ways, Southern Confederate States of America and the Northern United States of America, subsequent history, I think, would have been very different. And it's quite striking that immediately after the Civil War ends in 1865, European commentators in France and Germany and so on are saying that Europe needs to unify itself in the face of what is called a colossus that's now clearly emerging on the other side of the Atlantic. So my, if you like, final reflection on the Declaration of Independence and of 1776 is that spare a thought for the 1860s as well. And of course, if you do so, remember the address that Lincoln gave at the battlefield, the creation of the cemetery at Gettysburg, which contains one of the best definitions of what democracy ought to be about: government of the people, for the people, government of the people, by the people, for the people, he said, must not perish from the face of the earth. So that would be, that kind of rhetoric is not something you will hear in the commemoration speeches of 2026. But it's worth bearing in mind, I think, if we want to take a longer view of what the Declaration of Independence was about, what it was not about, and why the American Republic of today is a far cry from what the forefathers in 1776, or indeed in the 1860s, were on about. So thank you very much.
David, thank you so much for that. That was fascinating insight into the complexities of American religious history, as well as to the Declaration of Independence. We've plenty of time for discussion, so friends, feel free. If you'd just like to indicate, please, and keep an orderly queue. Alan, I see you first.
Yeah, I'm trying to ask you a question earlier, but I was muted. I'm sorry about that. My old friend Daniel Jenkins, long dead now, but Daniel, who spent most of his career as a minister, or at least half of it, in the States, Daniel used to say that the founding fathers had learned how to speak in congregational church meetings, often in Massachusetts. Would you bear that out?
Well, I wasn't around at the time, so I can't really say, but I would say that certainly kind of fits with my understanding of the forms of religiosity at the time. In other words, that this is a less, well, that there are certain congregations, there are certain sects that are more disciplined, but on the whole, this is a less autocratic church structure and church behavior than would be recognized in England at the time, so I don't know, but yeah, the religion was a subject of debate. It entered into political debate and social debate, and the founders and the new country were building on that freedom of religious expression that's more common, was more common in the colonies, and particularly as you went west. I mean, the striking thing, particularly after 1776, as the restrictions on westward expansion are lifted, the churches in the interior, in the Ohio Valley and so on, there's much more fluidity of religious expression, do-it-yourself kind of churches that that would be almost the norm.
Daniel's point is that the church meeting enabled people to learn how to speak their minds,
Yes.
what they believed God was telling them to do. They weren't subservient.
No, I can't, as I said, I'm not a specialist on this, but that seems to me a perfectly plausible view of what was going on.
Thank you.
I see John and Walter have their hands up. So may we go first to John and then to Walter.
Well, thank you, David, very much. I've not been to the US for a long time. My information is entirely through what gets filtered in the British media, and I realise that may be very misleading. But two questions that I think might be related. I mean, the first is the Seven Mountains started with family and ended with government. We hear a lot about this sort of Christian nationalism as a way of presenting government policy, justifying government policy. But from what we are told about the private lives of the people who are presenting this, the family aspect of traditional Christian values doesn't seem to be particularly prominent. We know about President Trump. I understand Hesketh got through 3 wives before the age of 40, and he was unfaithful to at least 2 of them. So in their version of Christianity, does the private morality simply not feature? Or do they persuade themselves that their own behaviour is somehow exceptional and justified because of the pressures they're under? I mean, what is this Christianity that they're presenting that they apparently say is crucial to family, which doesn't look like traditional Christianity?
No.
And the other half of the question is looking at it in a sense on the other end. I mean, is your perception that what we're seeing is simply a sort of Trump entourage, which is trying then to build up a support base? Or do you think that actually there is a fundamental shift in the American people that means that whether Trump comes or goes, whether he lives or dies, we now have to live with an America who really believes this Christian nationalism at more than a veneer of high level in Washington?
Okay, well, I'm more comfortable trying to answer the second part of your question than the first, because I share your perception or your skepticism about the moral standards of some of the people that you've mentioned. But then that's not something that I'm going to comment on. It's worth saying that there is, as part of the White House staff, what is called a faith office, and it's not actually just something that is identified with the current president. It was, I think, created in a certain form by George W. Bush, so George II, as I sometimes irreverently refer to him as, so that the son, around 2000. And it was kept going or resurrected by both Obama and Biden, usually with a title like the Office for Faith-Based Organizations. So in other words, linking the White House up with people of faith commitments that were not necessarily Christian, but were religious in various ways. And it's not clear how pro forma that was for some of the Democrats. but it certainly was there. And so what Trump's doing is not, with his office of his faith office, is not unique. Your question about whether this is going to continue, absolutely yes. I think one of the things that we should not delude ourselves about is the idea that what we're seeing now is simply the expression of the peculiarities, to put it politely, of a single one person, one president. Trump has been building on shifts in American life, which really go back decades. So it's customary for, if you like, people over here of liberal persuasion to trace back a kind of lineage that interests them, that goes back to, shall we say, LBJ's Great Society, the Kennedy and Johnson Civil Rights Act and Voting Rights Act in the 60s, back to Roosevelt's New Deal. The supporters of Trump will have a completely different intellectual genealogy, if you like, which will go back to, for example, the Goldwater campaign in 1964, which is remembered, if at all, as a kind of crank operation talking about nuclear war, but in fact was hugely important. His failure in 64 to win the election was hugely important for conservatives. It was the basis for many people's political, it was the start of many people's political education on the conservative side. It was the roots of Reagan in the 1980s and his presidency, and his presidency in turn has been an important precedent for the Trump campaign. So what they are talking about is a return to basics, which for them goes back to the, if you like, the false direction that was taken, perhaps in the New Deal, or certainly after the New Deal and after the Second World War. And whoever's going to come next is not going to be, it will be different from Trump, but will certainly, I think, follow much of that that kind of philosophy if it's a Republican president. And that's why I mentioned Vance, because at the moment he is the likely Republican candidate for 2028. You've already got a sense of what he is talking about in terms of his values.
I now see Walter and then Fleur. So go to Walter first, please, then Fleur.
Right. Well, thank you very much, David, for this extremely interesting perspective. I've got 3 points, I'm afraid, and only one of them is a question.
Right, okay.
The first is going back to what you were talking about with David Argent. Alan Argent. Isn't it the case, as indeed you were setting out, that quite a few of the authors of the Declaration of Independence were not Massachusetts men, but Virginians?
Yeah.
And they were, if they were religious, they were Anglicans. They were members of the Church of England, indeed. So that there seems to be a slight difference there. Maybe it's because it's the deists in Virginia who were involved. That it doesn't really matter what the religious constitution of Virginia was, though I believe, if I remember right, that by this time the church had been disestablished in Virginia. The second point is a question. Isn't it the case that, like other varieties of Christianity, conservative evangelicalism in America is among the general population is in decline, which makes it unlikely that this form of Christian nationalism is going to be the permanent setting of the religion politics complex in America. The third point is simply to recommend a book I've been reading, which is entitled Christianity and Identity by Scott Ronald. Well, I don't know how to pronounce his surname. It's spelt Paethth, Paeth, Paeth, I don't know. And it's specifically about Christian nationalism in America and what could be by liberal Christians put in its place, but it really goes beyond America. It's a general consideration of the relationship between national identity and Christian identity, or indeed religious identity in general. It's very interesting. Some bits are a bit hard to get through, but it's published by Whitford Stock. That's me.
Okay, thank you. Yes, well, yes, obviously, there are a lot of Virginians involved in the movement for independence. As I said, I just repeat what I said earlier, that the term deist covers a multitude, and the important point, I think, is that they believe in some kind of divine force or divine being, but they don't particularly identify it with revealed religion and formal Christianity and Christian church organizations. They will perhaps attend church at the local church on occasions when it matters during the year. It's not clear how important religious devotion is within their lives, but there is definitely a sense of a feeling that there is some kind of purpose to the natural universe, to put it in the loosest sense. What you say about conservative evangelicalism, yes, I accept that comment in a broad sense. On the other hand, what you can see is that when I mentioned that this faith office has been, going for in its present form for a quarter of a century, since the beginning of this century, clearly presidents, especially especially Republican presidents, but also Democrat presidents, feel it's necessary to have that kind of office in a loose sense to recognize religiosity within the country. So it's, I don't really know, but I certainly think that we should not be assuming that the Trump phenomenon is just an aberration. The United States is now a fundamentally polarized society, country and society, and that's a huge change from, say, well, the first time I went to the States, which is in the early 70s, where there were plenty of divisions, but there wasn't this same sense of fundamental divides and animosity. And I don't see that changing in the foreseeable future. And I think if there is a Democrat elected president, the Democrat is, even if coming from a a distinctive ethnic group or whatever, is going to be able to just ignore what we have seen. Plus the fact, of course, as you know, that American politics are not really just determined by who's in the White House, but who has control, what the balance of power is on Capitol Hill, the Senate and the House. And presidents of a liberal persuasion have often been stymied by the situation in Congress, whether they like it or not.
Thank you, David. Fleur, I now see.
Thank you very much, David. Again,
And John next, I see. Yep. Thank you, John. Fleur.
I'd like to start by thanking you, David, for what was a very stimulating presentation.
Thank you.
I'd like to come back, if I may, to comments which John Ellis raised about the family and link them, if I may, to your comments that Trumpism might not be a temporary aberration. I was suddenly reminded of the organization called The Family, which featured round about the time of the First World War, both in Germany, particularly associated with the Krupp steel complex.
Oh, yes. Mm-hmm.
And spread apparently with enthusiasm in America, to the degree that they instigated the prayer breakfasts, which have been a feature of political life ever since. Now, I have wondered more than once whether the emphasis on the family, which you point to, and can be linked in some way to a lingering memory by conservative evangelicals in particular of this organization, The Family, which could be, at the time was contested, as I understand the matter, in several different quarters and seemed to go underground in a sense. But could what you were saying, in fact, be seen as a re-emergence, a resurgence, if you like, of the family and its ethos in America?
Fleur, I can't answer that, I'm afraid. I don't know. I would, my instinct would be to say that it probably reflects a larger sense of the dislike by generally we're talking about white conservatives and white conservative males of gay rights, I mean, the idealization of the nuclear family, if you like, within that rhetoric, whether, taking the earlier point, whether or not they actually managed to observe that in practice in their marital arrangements and so on. But as to the impact of what you mentioned, that particular organization, I can't say. I don't know.
Thank you.
John.
Well, thank you. And it's just, in a sense, a supplementary to some of the others. It seems from what you're saying that the current Christian people around Trump are the evangelicals. Is there a movement from those that you might describe as moderates seeking to put forward alternative views which are more acceptable?
Is there a movement? Not, I think, not not a movement that's put its head above the parapet. Is there a mood? I think yes, definitely, because I think many Republicans of a more traditional form of conservative politics are very unhappy with the way that Trump has taken the Republican Party, and it's very much his party at the moment. It's just that, as you can see from some of the recent primary races, Trump has a hold on the Republican supporters, which is very, very strong. And people who try to run as candidates without his blessing are not successful. And that's the message at the moment. I think I mean, this is discussed probably every morning at breakfast, because my wife is American and is deeply disheartened by what's going on. But I mean, what I do say to her is that I think we have to, one of the things we wait for is the midterm elections in November, beginning of November, because there is I think the Democrats have a chance of winning 4 seats in the House, 3 to 4 seats in the House, which would change. I think more than 3 would actually give them a narrow majority. And there is now talk, partly because of the way that Trump has suppressed opposition in the Republican Party, there is talk of the possibility of low turnouts in some of the Senate races, which might even give the Democrats a chance of the Senate. So that may be wishful thinking on their part, but certainly the results in early November, and this would, I think, be something like the 4th of November with the elections, is going to be a significant litmus test for the mood of the country and the way that Trump's presidency is going. And if he loses control of one of the 2 houses, that will have some considerable effect on his freedom of maneuver, even for somebody who has very deliberately and effectively exploited the powers of the executive branch of government, in other words, the presidency, to the full in the last couple of years. So that would be, my advice. Watch this space, and November, I think, is going to be quite important.
David, thank you. We have reached 11 o'clock. I guess we could have one more question, if there is one more pressing question from anybody. If not.
Well, I might add, David, if I can, that another friend of mine, Jeff Cox, who died a few years ago, Jeff was professor at the University of Iowa and an expert on British history, modern British history. But it was in Jeff's front room that Bernie Sanders was persuaded to run as president. Bernie is ancient now, but does he have any followers who might stand in the presidential elections to come?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think Bernie Sanders bills himself as what a democratic socialist, which a socialist is a no-no word in American politics, in mainstream American politics. Sanders' success in running, in the past, is a testimony to his enormous energy, organization, and his appeal to young people, across generational divides. I'm not aware that there's anybody in that category. The current mayor of New York is felt to be somebody that needs to be watched, because he is of a completely different generation and is has a lot of appeal across across various ethnic groups. But no, I don't think you've got any obvious people who are going to take up the sort of Sanders mantle.
Thank you.
Walter, we'll make this the last question.
It's not a question. It's just to because the mayor of New York, Mamdani, has been mentioned.
Yeah.
It's to mention that he calls himself a socialist, and he won the New York mayoralty with a substantial majority, which I think is significant.
Yeah. Yes. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you so much, everyone. An enormous thanks to David for such a stimulating and incisive look at the legacy of the Declaration of Independence and the way it reverberates in modern American politics. David, we are much in your debt for that, and we are very truly grateful. Thank you so much for joining us.